This presentation will be a literary criticism using the feminist theory regarding Voltaire and his 1759 satire, Candide. The question to be answered is whether or not Candide wrote one of the first feminist novels. In order to answer this question, the roles of women and the characterization of women in literature in the 1700s should be reviewed. In addition, we will be evaluating Voltaire's own perspective and, of course, his novel, Candide. By the end of this discussion, the evidence will indeed show that Voltaire's Candide is a novel that would be considered a feminist literary piece, as it challenged the traditional constraints and objectification placed on women and argued through its female characters that women, in fact, could be significant contributors to society beyond the confined roles of the 1700s. Before discussing Candide specifically, let's define what is meant when we are analyzing a piece from the feminist theory perspective. What we mean by this is we are reviewing the ways in which an author's work reinforces or undermines the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. As you likely suspect, there has been a change in the way women have been characterized over time, and this has reflected the changes within society. Interestingly, the first wave of feminism occurred in the late 1700s, and many think that it was inspired by the Enlightenment period of the time. During this Enlightenment, dogma and the institutions of church and religion were challenged with a new way of thinking that involved asking questions and reasoning. This new way of thinking included the way females were viewed in society. This is important because this is the time when Voltaire lived. To get a better idea of society when Candide was written, let's review the roles of women during this time. As one might suspect, the 1700s was a patriarchal society with traditional gender roles. Women were tasked with being the household manager as well as having and raising the children with very little opportunities outside the home. Marriages were arranged particularly in society's upper class because status and wealth were a factor. However, the lower classes actually had more choices because they were already in poverty. Some women were educated, but it was restricted to the wealthy class, and the subjects in which they were educated were limited. They were expected only to study such things as music, needlework, and writing, and were never given the opportunity to study math and science. In addition, women had no voice in politics. It is also beneficial to review the literature during the time in which Candide was published to ascertain the influences and how other authors chose to portray female characters. During the early part of the 1700s, there were authors that used females as heroines. However, their characters were written from the viewpoint of a male and involved either virtue or vice, with appearances and sexuality a prominent feature of the female characterization. For example, the 1712 poem The Rape of the Lock features a wealthy female obsessed with her looks who has a lock of her hair cut by a man, and she is not happy about it. Fanny Hill is a 1749 novel that reviews a female's past sexual encounters. Then, after Candide in the late 1700s, The Sorrow of Young Werther portrays women as resilient, and then Mary Wollstonecraft published her A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. Although this is a small sample size, there does seem to be a mixture of the characterization of women, and some books actually challenge the traditional characterization of females in the later portion of the 1700s. This corresponds with the first wave of feminism that was presented in an earlier slide. Now, I want to discuss Candide's author, Voltaire. Voltaire was a prominent author born in Paris, France, and he was part of a wealthy family. As a writer, he wrote controversial pieces that often got him in trouble. As already mentioned, he was a writer during the Enlightenment period, which was an age that taught reason, the value of toleration, and encouraged one to discuss their own beliefs and thinking. Since we are focusing on Voltaire and feminism, it would be prudent to look at the relationships he had with females in his lifetime. To begin with, Voltaire had a mother who died when he was only 7. Although he was very young, she did support his passion of writing. Voltaire never married, but did fall in love with Emily du Châtelet and had a long-time affair with her, even though she was already married. This is an important relationship because she lived a life that was not typical for a female of the 1700s. Specifically, Emily, who was extremely intelligent, pursued her academic passions, and she was able to do this because her family was wealthy and had influence. For example, she studied math and physics, in contrast to the traditional subjects that women studied during the time. She even wrote a physics textbook and translated Newton's philosophy with Voltaire, and he admired her for all her work and intelligence. Their passionate affair eventually morphed into a close friendship. Then, when she was in her 40s, she discovered she was pregnant and died after childbirth in 1749. Voltaire was devastated. Voltaire published Candide 10 years after Emily du Châtelet's death, and in response to philosopher Leibniz's theory of optimism that believed we lived in the best possible world and human suffering therefore was a benefit to humanity. It ended up being one of Voltaire's most famous works and was published on January 15, 1759 under a pseudonym because he was worried that his satirical novel would get him in trouble because the novel also criticized the institutions of the church and state. However, people loved it. It was short, easy to read, and humorous. In fact, it was so popular that it became a bestseller. The story of Candide follows a naive protagonist who is named Candide as he goes on a series of adventures and misadventures that take him in different parts of the world as he tries to reunite with his love, Cunegonde. As he faces challenges, he rationalizes their outcomes by using the principle of optimism that everything happens for a reason, to which he was introduced to by his mentor, Pangloss. However, after witnessing cruel events such as torture, execution, rape, and robbery, he reevaluates his blind optimism philosophy. Now that we have discussed the plot, we will look at how the male and female characters are portrayed and interact, to review the piece in terms of the feminist theory. Although there are numerous characters in Candide, I chose to cover two important male characters, Candide and Pangloss, and then two important female characters, Cunegonde and the old woman. Candide is the protagonist of the novel, and when we are first introduced to him in Chapter 1, he is living a very sheltered life in the Baron's castle, for he is the illegitimate son of the Baron's sister. Life is good, and he falls in love with the Baron's daughter, Cunegonde. The other person living there is Pangloss, and this is where he learns everything happens for a reason. Unfortunately, Candide gets caught kissing Cunegonde, and the Baron kicks him out, and he's forced out into the world. This is how he faces a series of adventures, which includes being forced to join the Bulgarian army, experiencing an earthquake, shipwrecks, and even killing people. By the last chapter, Candide is living on a farm with Cunegonde and a few others, and rejects the blind optimism philosophy. Through the course of the novel, there are specific traits that can be assigned to Candide. First of all, Candide is naive. The novel mentions this on the very first page that he is, quote, simplicity of spirit, which was the reason why I presume he had his name Candide. Candide was simple and inexperienced because he had lived the majority of his life isolated and separated within his castle. In fact, when he left to go out in the world, there are numerous occasions where his lack of knowledge is apparent. For example, when he is approached by two men dressed in blue, he never suspects that they are soldiers. After observing him, they exclaim that Candide is, quote, the support, the defender, the hero of the Bulgarians. Despite the obvious evidence, Candide did not suspect the men were trying to recruit him in the Bulgarian army, as he, quote, could not yet very well realize how he was a hero. Candide is also naive because he was very slow to question the ideal of blind optimism despite the evidence of brutality and suffering, as Candide doesn't reject the ideal until the very end of the story in chapter 30 when he says, quote, we must cultivate our garden. Candide is also an emotional man, as he cries on more than one occasion when he leaves Cunegonde. For example, after being kicked out of the castle in chapter 2, he, quote, walked a long while without knowing where, weeping, raising his eyes to heaven, turning them often towards the most magnificent of castle, which imprisoned the purest of noble young ladies. Finally, Candide can be seen as indecisive and has hard time evaluating situations and making decisions. For example, after killing the Inquisitor and Don Issachar, Candide was unsure what to do, and he ended up asking the old woman what to do. Next, we will discuss the male character philosopher Pangloss. In Chapter 1, we find Pangloss also living in the Baron's castle, and he is the tutor to the Baron's son and Candide, and he teaches, quote, all is for the best. He is forced out into the world after the castle is attacked and meets up with Candide. Pangloss has a very difficult time in that he contracts syphilis, he undergoes a failed hanging, and witnesses several other tragedies. However, he continues to stick by his optimism philosophy that everything happens for a reason. After evaluating his role in the story, Pangloss's main trait is that he is blindly optimistic to a fault. He consistently teaches everything happens for a reason and that, quote, all is for the best. After all, he represents Leibniz's philosophy, so Voltaire uses Pangloss to ridicule the optimistic belief. For example, Pangloss says, quote, if Columbus had not caught in an island in America this disease, which is evidently opposite to the great end of nature, we should have neither chocolate or cochineal, to explain how syphilis benefits humanity and, quote, all is for the best, while the disease ravages his body. By the end of the novel, his character does not change and sticks with the same thoughts and ideas, and despite exaggerated experiences that would leave one to think other ideas. Next, we will move on to discussing the two female characters in Candide. However, before getting into the specific characters of Cunegonde and the old woman, I will present to you situations and behaviors that all female characters in the story experience. First, all women in Candide were objective. When discussing the term objectified, it is helpful to review what is meant by that term. There are at least 8 situations where objectification is attached to females in the research regarding feminist theory, and of those, I have listed 5 that I think particularly resonate with Candide. The first is denial of autonomy. In the story, none of the women are able to act on their own. Second, ownership. In the story, the women are sold and owned by men. In addition, there is denial of subjectivity as their feelings and experiences are not taken into account within the storyline. There is also reduction to body, and finally, they are treated according to their appearances. Thus, objectification of females is rampant in this novel. However, it is important to remember that this is a satire. Although there is some overlap with objectification, I wanted to highlight experiences that were commonly faced by the female characters. For example, they undergo severe abuse with repeated sexual assaults, beatings, and are sold into slavery with their value linked to beauty. Prostitution is also mentioned throughout the novel. Let's now take a closer look at Cunegonde. When we first meet her, she is wealthy and beautiful, living in the castle as a daughter of the German Baron. In fact, she is described as comely, plump, and desirable. She becomes Candide's love interest, and when the castle is invaded in the early portions of the novel, she is pushed out into the world after seeing her family killed. She is raped and sold and finds Candide again only to be separated again. However, by the end of chapter 30, she's gone through quite a few trials and tribulations. She has also lost her beauty, which is a point made by Candide, who she finds again by the end of the novel. However, she finds happiness in being an excellent pastry cook, even though she is no longer beautiful, wealthy, or living in a castle. After looking at Cunegonde's portrayal in Candide, there are specific traits we can assign her character. First of all, she is very resilient as she pushed forward despite her difficult conditions and experiences. For example, she witnessed a horrible Bulgarian attack on her castle and the death of her family who were disemboweled and torn apart. This attack is when she lost all her wealth and so she was sold into slavery. She was also raped repeatedly throughout the story, and she told Candide, quote, "I cried, I struggled, I bit, I scratched, I wanted to tear out the tall Bulgarian's eyes." Still, she was not going to let these terrible things consume her. In fact, she tells Candide that these acts, quote, "are not always mortal." Cunegonde can also be described as sexually curious and forward with her feelings. For example, in Chapter 1, Cunegonde, quote, "saw between the bushes Dr. Pangloss giving a lesson in experimental natural philosophy to her mother's chambermaid, a little brown wench, very pretty and very docile." Therefore, Cunegonde was, quote, "pensive and filled with desire after watching Pangloss have sex with the maid." Cunegonde was also forward with her feelings as she openly discusses her feelings to Candide after her misfortunes. In other words, she is the one who pursued Candide. Finally, Cunegonde is intelligent and open to the opinions of others. In order to survive all her ordeals, she had to be strategic. She also used her mind to help others escape, such as Candide when he was detained by the Inquisitor. Cunegonde had the old woman find him and nurse him back to health. She also questions Pangloss's blind optimist theory before Candide and says, quote, "I love you with all my heart, but my soul is still full of fright at which I have seen and experienced." She says this after Candide kills 2 people and they are on the run. Cunegonde also is open to listening to the opinions of others. For example, when she's complaining about the hardships she has faced, the old woman tells her own story. After hearing the old woman's history, she, quote, "gave all the civilities due to a person of her ranking merit." Besides Cunegonde, another important female character in Candide is the old woman. Before meeting Cunegonde and Candide, she was wealthy, beautiful, and she was to marry a prince. However, when we meet her in the story, she is the servant helping Cunegonde save Candide from the Inquisitor. In fact, she softly speaks to a beaten-up Candide in Chapter 6 and says, quote, "My son, take courage and follow me." Throughout the remainder of Candide, both Cunegonde and Candide follow her when they are in a difficult situation. Similar to Cunegonde, the old woman had to be strong and resilient. For example, in chapters 11 and 12, she relays her difficult journey having faced the death of her fiancé from a jealous mistress. She was taken prisoner, raped, she was witnessed her mother being torn apart by all limbs, she was sold and resold as a slave, she saw the outcome of natural disasters and experienced the brutality of war with death. She even survived the plague and lost one of her buttocks when starving soldiers cut it off to eat. Thus, the old woman is very resilient. The old woman proved to be a skilled problem solver. For example, she was the one who came up with the plan to escape to Cadiz using, quote, 3 Andalusian horses in the stables with bridles and saddles, after Candide killed Don Issachar and the Inquisitor. The old woman is the one who figured out a way for them to get money when their jewels were stolen, and she made the plan on how to survive when the Grey Friar shows up looking for them after the murders. The old woman is also prudent, as the narrator states, and practical. For example, she thinks for herself and anticipates complications and figures out the best outcome. For example, she predicts when the Grey Friar was going to come look for them, and advises Cunegonde to marry the Lord in South America because it would be the best possible way for her to have a more comfortable life. She was also prudent and wise when she discussed human suffering with Cunegonde after Cunegonde was complaining about her hardships, and she said, quote, "I've had the experience, I know the world." Throughout all her advice, the woman is unemotional and level-headed. For example, she has no problem in advising Cunegonde to marry the Lord in South America, despite Cunegonde's love for Candide, because it was the decision that offered Cunegonde the best chance of survival. She is also unemotional when she decides their escape plan. Finally, the old woman is hopeful. In fact, the old woman makes a point to say, quote, 100 times I wanted to kill myself, but I still loved life more. Now that we have looked at the historical perspective of the 1700s, Voltaire's own history, and the Candide novel with its characters, I would like to make some conclusions. First of all, it is clear that the Age of Enlightenment did encourage a new way of thinking, and females began to be seen beyond their traditional roles, and literature began to reflect that, especially towards the end of the 1700s after Voltaire published Candide. When looking at Voltaire's own personal history, we see that he had a significant relationship with a woman who was intelligent and pursued her academic passions, which was not typical for the time period, and this affected his writing perspective. Taking this into account and the characterizations of the male and female characters that we just discussed, Candide is a feminist novel in that it undermines the oppression of women through Voltaire's use of satire. Specifically, there are gender reversals in this novel. For example, Cunegonde and the old woman are given masculine characteristics that include being problem solvers, being unemotional, being wise, and being resilient. On the other hand, Candide and Pangloss are given more of the traditional feminine characteristics that had been assigned to women, and these include being emotional, being naive, and being unable to learn from the world and its experiences. In fact, Voltaire gave females the strongest characteristics in Candide. This suggests that he went beyond the stereotypes of females being weak and emotional and showed them capable of making significant contributions in the novel Candide, but from a larger perspective, society. In fact, the old woman in Candide is essentially the hero of the story. After surviving the significant hardships that she did, coming from a wealthy family, being thrown out into the world, facing rape, being sold with a body part being used to feed a soldier, and ending up being a servant to Cunegonde, she showed great strength, and when the characters Candide and Cunegonde needed someone to show them what to do, she was the person. She used her own thinking and did not use the thinking of others, and it was successful in getting them out of harm's way. So, the old woman was the mentor, and Voltaire gave her personal characteristics of a leader, which is a male stereotype from the 1700s. Given that we are looking at this from the feminine theory, I did want to address the extreme objectification that Voltaire presents in the story. It is important to remember that he wrote a satire, and the extreme sexual abuse, the slavery, and other mistreatment caused attention to the mistreatment of women in society. In particular, he questioned the attachment to physical appearances and beauty to the female's worth, and in Candide, the women were either beautiful or ugly. Even at the end of the novel, the character Candide commented on Cunegonde's lack of beauty. However, Cunegonde did not seem to notice and continued on being a productive person on the farm. Voltaire wanted to call attention to society's obsession with associating females only with their physical appearances so as to disprove this objectification and see women for other qualities and capabilities. Thus, I would recommend this book as it is an example of a literary piece that undermines and challenges the oppression of women in the 18th century. Although the primary purpose of Voltaire's Candide is to criticize the blind optimism philosophy of Leibniz, he also uses the book to address the role of women in the 18th century society. Specifically, Voltaire uses satire in order to show the low regard of women and at the same time show that they are more than just objects.